Let's get started. As I said, thank you so much for joining us today. For those that don't know me, my name is Maytal Kowalski. I'm the Executive Director of JSpaceCanada. At JSpaceCanada, our vision is a future of self-determination and sovereignty for Jews and Palestinians in Israel and Palestine, championed by the Canadian Jewish community. We aim to shift the conversation around Israel-Palestine from our political institutions to our Shabbat tables. Before we proceed, I'm going to acknowledge that for me, I am right now based on the ancestral homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, aka Vancouver. And for those joining us on the webinar, I know that we are on the we are all on various ancestral homelands of Indigenous people across Canada, caretakers and stewards of this land for time immemorial, each with their own traditions, languages, and history. So thank you all for joining us from wherever you are joining us from today. So I hope that for those joining today, you've seen at least some portion of our 2025 survey of Canadian Jews. This is the third survey, I believe, that we've done of the Canadian Jewish community. And we're happy to have been joined for the second time in partnership on this year with our friends from the New Israel Fund of Canada and Canadian Friends of Peace Now, who we'll hear from a little bit later, and who co-sponsored this survey along with us. We really could not do this work without them and their fantastic organization. So taking this moment to say thank you so much to both of those organizations for their friendship and partnership throughout this process. We also had the treat this year of working with pollster and political analyst, Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, whose polling, analysis, and writing I have long admired, and I think everyone on this call has as well. She really helped elevate our work and our rigor in this survey, and I'm really excited to have had the opportunity to work with her and to hear from her a little bit more today. And so that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to dig into the survey a bit deeper. We're going to have a chance to go through some of the data that we've uncovered. Dahlia is going to give us a quick overview of her findings, and then each organization is going to have a chance to discuss a part of the survey that maybe they found most interesting, is most relevant to their work, that they think that their supporters and those of you on this call would want to hear about, and we're going to ask Dahlia to dig a little bit deeper into that. Finally, at the end of this webinar, so we're probably going to run for an hour and a half, but as I mentioned, it is recorded if you can't stay for the whole time. But we do want to make sure that we get a chance to get to your audience questions. So we will ask questions at the end, the last half hour or so. I will read out audience questions, but you can put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any point throughout the webinar, and then I will go through and kind of pick those at random once we get to the Q&A. So I think without further ado, because we have a lot to get through and we're all excited to be here, I want to pass it over to Dahlia to give us, as I mentioned, kind of her key findings and analysis. And then after Dahlia, we'll go to Ben Moraine, the Executive Director of New Israel Fund of Canada, and he'll ask a question about the piece of data that was most interesting to him. So if we can bring Dahlia into the screen to get started. And I will remove myself from the screen. Great.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you to Maytal and I won't name everybody, but to all the organizations for bringing me into this project. I'm in the unenviable position of trying to summarize a very rich survey in 15 minutes, which as the team knows, is nearly impossible for me. But to do that, I'm not, to avoid going over and taking up all of our time, I'm not going to walk through every data point. In fact, I'm not going to walk through very many. What I'm going to try to do are focus on what I think are the biggest insights, takeaways, and there are many more, but I'll try to just go through what I see as really important, and then we'll walk through the questions and more data will come up. But these are the ones I want you to keep in mind. Now, the other thing to remember is that this survey was conducted in November 2025. It was really kind of a different time, right? And so since then we have the ceasefire has gone into effect. We're in a completely different phase now, and so a number of the questions that we asked were about the war. But I think that they're not actually behind us. In other words, what we learned from how Canadian Jews viewed the war, I think, tells us a great deal about where Canadian Jews are in general with relation to Israel. And the main point there is that they are following extremely closely. They were following immediately from 2023 and 4, and they continue to be following at a very high rate, over 80%. What we found is that the large majority of Canadian Jews still in this time in the fall of 2025 describe this in justified terms. When we really ask people, three descriptions that are kind of legitimate or justified for the war, and three descriptions that are somewhere in the realm of war crimes or ethnic cleansing or genocide, the vast majority, over 70%, I think it's actually 76%, you'll see the numbers, see this as a legitimate war, whether it was self-defense, hostage release, or just a war, the kind of thing that happens between two equal sides. And so they really are retaining, the majority, a very firm majority of Canadian Jews retain a defensive position about this war, and they justify it and they deflect blame for the most severe consequences. I should say another way of deflecting blame that I think we could also pay attention to is that people here, the Canadian Jews that we surveyed, definitely distinguish between the Israeli government and the people, and that's the same thing for Palestinians for the most part. There are, a solid, a solid number, over half who believe, about half or over half, who believe that these are mostly the actions of the Israeli government, and the same thing with relation to Palestinians, that the actions of October 7th were mostly about Hamas more than actual society. So these are interesting nuances to keep in mind. But overall, we're looking at a very protective position towards Israel with relation to the war. Having said that, if we zoom out and go a little further back, like, what I think became very sensitive certainly in the first year of the war was talking about the context for the war became like a bad word, came to seem like it was justifying, you know, October 7th, which of course it should never have been interpreted that way. But the fact is, when we step back in our survey, without using the word context, and simply ask people about longer term Israeli policy towards the Palestinians, there we found something very different, which is that over half, just over half, not huge majorities, but over half of Canadian Jews actually break with Israeli government positions with relation to Palestinians. And so what we found, for example, is that just over half of Canadian Jews support a two-state solution, an absolute majority. Now, that is completely opposed to the Israeli government. The current Israeli government very, very openly opposes anything like a Palestinian state or a two-state solution. And this was well before October 7th, of course. We have a similar majority, just over half of Canadian Jews in our survey, who are opposed to settlement expansion, opposed to annexation. We asked this in a couple of different ways in the survey. And they're also opposed, or they're more likely to support measures against the people in Israel, the ministers who are most closely associated with those attitudes, primarily Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich. These are ministers in the government, for anybody who doesn't know, a Minister of National Security and the Minister of Finance, who doubles as a Minister of Settlements, which is kind of my term for what Smotrich also does in the government. But in all of those ways, we have the majority of Israelis who are against settlement expansion, against annexation, even when we say it is the declared policy of the Israeli government, and they're more likely to support positions that the Canadian government could take against Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And so that's an indication that in the bigger picture of how how Canadian Jews look at Israeli government policy, they themselves don't actually agree with where the government was in the longer term background well before October 7th. And that translates into greater support for any messages from the progressive Canadian Jewish community with relation to those issues. They're more likely to have purchase with Canadian Jews, more likely to have a majority who would agree with that kind of criticism, certainly than anything that would involve criticizing the war. And in any case, with the war in a very different kind of phase, I hesitate to call it a ceasefire or an end to the, I hesitate to call it an end to the war, I should say. But in any case, trying to raise critiques of the war is a harder sell for Canadian Jews, and now even more so because it's in some sort of a ceasefire. We'll see where that goes. I think the other really interesting thing to see in the pulling back, view of how Canadian Jews view Israeli policy is that there's very strong support for Israeli democracy. Canadian Jews, I think, we can broadly say, don't really question that Israel is or was a democracy. And they feel very strong. Three-quarters certainly believe it is, so that's very strong. And a very strong majority, 81%, agree with a sort of message statement that we tested that Canada should strongly support democracy in Israel. Now, people may have interpreted that in many different ways, so we have to think about it as kind of raw material for teasing out what that actually means, because at the same time, we found quite a bit of, uncertainty about exactly what's happening around the judicial reform overhaul plans. But the fact is that this image of Israel as a democracy is both prominent and important to Israelis, enough that sorry, to Canadian Jews, enough so that they think that the Canadian government should support Israel's democratic character. The other thing we found is that an absolute majority of the Canadian Jews we surveyed believe that that Canada should support democracy because it's a reflection of Zionism. So the idea of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is certainly like tied into people's image of their own Zionism. Another thing that we need to keep in mind is that if you look at the previous point that I made, that there is critique, or at least the majority of Canadian Jews break with the Israeli government over issues related to over its policies related to Palestinians. And then the second part of what I just said, which is that there's very high support for democracy, we all notice that that Canadian Jews, sorry, I'm so used to talking about Israeli public opinion, that Canadian Jews don't really make a connection between those two issues. So the majority did not really see that war, conflict, and occupation undermines democracy in Israel. Nevertheless, and I say this, advisedly, we had 37% who agree with the idea that the war, conflict, and occupation undermines democracy in Israel. Now, if I mistakenly said Israelis for this insight, it's because this is very similar to what we see in Israel too. Israelis also tended not to make the connection between the government's efforts to reform or undermine the Israeli judiciary and thereby its democracy and the occupation. I mean, anybody who had been paying attention to the kind of slogans or conversation during the demonstrations and the protests of 2023 against the judicial overhaul you would remember that most Israelis absolutely refused to bring in anything to do with occupation. So the majority of them didn't really see that connection either. I had tested this in surveys. And so in this way, there is definitely an overlap between the two populations. And that's why actually I do think it's significant that even 37% agree that those two issues are connected and that war, conflict, and occupation undermines democracy in Israel. I also think that that means that there's an opportunity for, progressive communities in general, and certainly in the Canadian context, Canadian progressive Jews talking to other Canadian Jews, to make that connection, to simply, connect those dots. It's not because people are opposed to the idea, they just didn't, I think for the most part, they really just didn't think about it. One of the things we tried to do, so now that you have, what I gave you before was up until now was kind of a lay of the land, okay, strong defensiveness regarding the war, much more divergence of opinions between Canadian Jews and Israeli policy with relation to the Palestinians in general, but a strong conviction among Canadian Jews that Israel is democratic and should remain democratic, and yet broad opportunity to try to connect those two dots. The other thing the survey tried to do was look at what the Canadian government could be doing and should be doing in the eyes of Canadian Jews who were surveyed, but based on things that progressive communities might support. And so this is a challenge because the idea is to see where there might be support among Canadian Jews for the Canadian government taking steps to try to change Israeli policy, or steps targeting Israel to say, to basically pressure Israel into changing course. And we did this through an experimental mode. We presented a few policy measures designed to put pressure on Israel. And for half of the respondents, for half of the sample, we presented them alongside parallel measures designed to change Palestinian policies. So we had kind of an even set of policies directed at Palestinians to get them to change their policy, and policies directed against Israel to get Israel to change its policies. And we asked people, do you think the Canadian government should be doing that? We also tried to do it separately. We took half of the sample and said, would you just support or oppose these policies targeting the Israeli government without looking at policies directed at the Palestinians to see if there was any difference, to see if maybe people responded more supportively, let's say, to measures targeting Israel if they also knew that they were targeting Palestinians. So let me just start, I'll take you out of your suspense and say that there actually was not a huge difference between those two ways of testing it, except for on a couple of the measures. But, we didn't get an enormous difference overall, except for on a few points. And that's, basically the measures that were more likely to be supported by Canadian Jews for what the Canadian government could do to change Israel's direction reflected the kinds of critique that I mentioned earlier. So there was higher support for sanctioning far-right ministers in Israel, particularly figures like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, sanctioning violent settlers, right? Because we found that the majority are against settlement expansion. And on those measures, you had approximately 40% support, and then a little bit higher when people were asked in the context of also looking at measures against Palestinians. When we asked, and for another one, which was increasing humanitarian support for Gaza, which is not exactly directed against Israel, but the ones that got much lower support, significantly lower support, in terms of what the Canadian government could be doing to pressure Israel were not surprisingly the most politically sensitive issues. When we asked about, was it right for Canada to recognize a Palestinian state before there's an actual peace agreement, and the question of an arms embargo. And, obviously the issue of an arms embargo is pretty much the most toxic, and sensitive issue in general for, I think, Jewish communities in the West. For any of those who watched Prime Minister Netanyahu or heard about Prime Minister Netanyahu's press conference yesterday, he actually said, well, some of the soldiers who died in this war died because they ran out of ammunition, and that was partly because of arms embargoes. So he was referring to the US, but obviously this is, extremely sensitive and very, very politicized in Israel. So let's just to give you a sense of how much support there is, we had approximately or just over 40% support for the policies that were more likely to be supported, including when we tested the question of sanctioning far-right ministers together with measures directed against the Palestinian leadership, we actually reached a majority of 51% who supported it from Canadian Jews. And for the really politically sensitive items that I just mentioned, support was still within the 20 to 25% range, which is interesting because that's not nothing either, right? In the context, of Canadian Jewish life, we shouldn't dismiss that entirely. In fact, that 20 to 25% indicates a pretty consistent category within Canadian Jews who support many of the progressive positions in our survey, whether it's taking a critical view of what Israel was doing in the war or supporting these kinds of measures. And the last couple of things I'll say before I stop and leave us time for questions is that reminder that there is a very strong engagement on the issue. Again, vast majority who are following the issues very closely, but there's also a very strong commitment to Canadian Jewish civic activism. So when we ask people how important they think various forms of Canadian Jewish activity is, we had large majorities who supported many different kinds. But I thought it was interesting that we looked at a number, we had a list of about 6 or 7 groups and kinds of activities, and the top 3 that people said were the most important for Canadian Jews to support was Canadian Jews who are active against anti-Semitism, who are combating anti-Semitism. That's practically a consensus in the survey, not surprisingly. But the next most highly supported one, or the one that people said was most important, was groups supporting Israeli democracy. Okay, so again, that issue of believing that Israel is democratic and wanting to ensure that it remains democratic remains critically important in various measures in the survey. And the third, in a way, maybe not surprisingly, but the third, ranked activity was supporting the Israeli peace camp. Okay, so that also still has a lot of purchase in Israeli society, and in fact, purchase in Canadian Jewish society for supporting the Israeli peace camp. And I think it's interesting that the only activity we tested that received only a minority who thought it would be important to support this community is whether Canadian Jews should support the settler movement. And 37% said it should, said it's important, but that is the lowest ranked. And so that also says something about where there are opportunities to advance more progressive positions and oppose the extremist positions of the current Israeli government. So we have lots of lots of data in the survey. I'm trying to keep this, just to the big insights I think are important, but there's much more in here, and I know that they will come out when we discuss it. I guess the final word I'll say is that I'm talking about the average, the overall data findings. But within that, we see major breakdowns based on different kinds of groups. Of course, the Canadian Jewish community is not, monolithic, and there are deep, deep divisions, mostly based, as you've seen from the presentation, or if you will read it, you'll see that there are mostly divisions based on people's religious affiliation, which reflects generally their levels of religious observance or their interpretation of religious observance, their political leanings, to some extent their age. But I think really the religious affiliation and their political leanings in terms of their vote and self-identified ideology really reflects much more where we see the biggest divisions over these kinds of issues that we've tested. So I'll stop here and looking forward to answering questions.
Let's go. Thank you so much, Dahlia. Very interesting. Yes, we will dig into this a little bit further. And let's start with Ben Moraine, if we can keep Dahlia in screen, but also spotlight Ben. Ben is the Executive Director of the New Israel Fund of Canada. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Ben.
Hi, everybody. Dahlia, thank you again for doing this with you. It's so fun to get into the numbers of this and to have asked the questions that we asked to see if we could probe a little bit deeper than the surveys we've done in the past. And my question deals with some of so one of the questions about democracy and the connection between democracy and the other issues that also had very high levels of support from Canadian Jews. I'm thinking about slide 26 is a great example. We see pretty high levels of opposition to settlements or annexation, and we have even higher levels of support for Israeli democracy. And yet, what we see in this slide is you mentioned it a moment ago, but if we could just dive in a little bit deeper, these huge numbers of I don't knows, and as you kind of pointed out, still within those who do know or have an opinion about the matter, it leans heavily towards that there is a connection. So can you pull this apart for us, and can you draw on some of your similar survey efforts in other places? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah. Well, I think you have to remember that the issue of the judicial overhaul, okay, or the assault on the judiciary, which is, that may sound like a politicized way of describing it, but I wrote a paper called The Assault on Israel's Judiciary in 2021, okay, because it had been going on for about 10 years by then. And if anybody is surprised to hear me say that it had been going on for 10 years by then, you and the Israeli public, because the Israeli public was barely paying attention to it for most of that time. I don't think I realized how little the Israeli public was really paying attention to it. And so you can imagine that communities abroad, even those who are deeply committed to Israel, really weren't focused on this issue. It was kind of a marginal story that didn't have much of a presence in international coverage of the issue. And then in 2023, in January, the government came out with its program to reform the judiciary, or what, the majority of Israelis thought was an assault or an overhaul. And it was, I think, only because of the major social backlash that the international community attention and Jewish communities around the world, and in North America in particular, where you have a strong sense of liberal democracy and a constitutional order, that's when people started paying attention, and they had to start from scratch learning the issue, right? They had to start from scratch saying, wait, what are they trying to reform? Why is the Supreme Court suddenly controversial? It wasn't suddenly controversial, but it was simply off the radar, even for Israelis, or they may have been discussing it privately and you could see it in survey research, but it wasn't huge in the headlines, even in Israel, and even more so, or even less so, I should say, among foreign coverage, and even among Jewish communities. So
I
if you're
can attest
starting
to
from
that
scratch,
because the work of the New Israel Fund is principally funding Israeli civil, social, and human rights NGOs in Israel, and we had been paying attention to it for that decade before,
yeah.
and receiving it was like pushing a boulder uphill. It was very hard for people to believe that democracy was under threat in Israel until 2023.
Right. And so once people started doing a crash course on the issues, what did they do? I mean, I'm speaking now for the diaspora communities who are paying attention to this. They started listening to what Israelis were saying about it. They started looking at the debate within Israel over the judiciary, which is presented very much as a question of the correct balance of powers between governing authorities. And it's presented as a question of whether Netanyahu is trying to consolidate power or protect himself against or attack the judiciary because of his corruption trials. In other words, Israelis are focusing on it as a completely domestic issue, which I think is a fiction. There is no real separation between Israel and the Palestinians, not geographically, but not politically, not bureaucratically, in so many ways. And certainly its democracy can't be separated from that issue. But I completely accept that it's sort of well hidden. And I don't even mean conspiratorially hidden, although there are efforts to hide it. But really the way it's evolved, it's hard to physically see, which is why shameless self-promotion, which is why I wrote a book about it, because I did not think it was obvious, and it certainly isn't obvious to Israelis, that the ongoing policies of occupation are flowing from directly within the same branches of governance, the same governing authorities that govern their own lives. They think of it as somewhere else, even though they all know that many Israel, that 500,000 Israelis live in the West Bank and another 300, 250, 300,000 Jews in East Jerusalem. They know that, but they think of the occupation as something alien, foreign, or they did until October 7th. And so when they think about, so when the Israeli discourse is focused on the issue of the judiciary as almost completely an internal domestic issue, and they inherently see the Palestinians as something completely other, the situation itself as separate outside of Israel's normal day-to-day governance, that's how the international audiences started to see it as well. Okay, and so I think that what happened was, as the way it was covered, um, certainly in international media, and I wouldn't venture to say I read every single article in the Canadian or American Jewish media, but I mean the conversation really reflected the Israeli conversation. So first of all, a lot of people didn't know a lot about it. Secondly, the way it was eventually presented didn't openly make that connection, and so I think that's the main explanation. I will point out something else that we found, which is that the more progressive um, segments of our sample who were more likely to see a connection between war occupation, the judicial overhaul, and undermining Israel's democracy, they were less likely to say, I don't know, okay, in a couple of different measures. Whereas the people who took a more hardline position and weren't as concerned either by war and occupation undermining democracy or weren't as concerned about the judicial overhaul, by their own acknowledgement, had higher levels of I don't know, which means they probably haven't learned the issue that well, but they're sort of defensive on behalf of the Israeli government's approach.
Thanks, Dahlia. Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. That was a great question, great explanation. Let's go over to, if we can take Ben off the spotlight, and let's bring in Gabriella Gallagher, who is the National Chair of Canadian Friends of Peace Now, and we'll hear your question next, Gabriella.
Thank you. I don't think I'm on camera yet, but you can hear my voice. Yeah. Okay. Dahlia, my question is focused on the West Bank and settlements and annexation, because that's the work of Peace Now in Israel. It's to oppose that and to promote the two-state solution, and we support Peace Now in Israel, of course. So we were heartened to see that there were 53% of survey respondents were against annexation, and a similar close to percentage were against the idea of annexation. And yet, similar to what Ben was asking, there's such a large percentage of respondents that were ambivalent and said they don't know. They don't know what the right course is. And what I'd like to know is again, what might account for such a large number of people being ambivalent and or not answering, and what kind of messaging on this particular issue might be effective.
I just want to make sure, when you say on this particular issue, you mean the settlement expense,
The
right?
settlements and
Yeah.
annexation. So not
Settlements and
the
annexation, yeah.
issue of democracy, but you did, of course, make a connection there. But
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that the don't know rates, in general reflect the reality that if people are, I think the way I explain it is that they are responding, the few, the smaller percentages who do support these kinds of things. And you saw, for example, only 1% supported expansion in Gaza, but there was slightly higher percent who supported expansion in other areas. They're doing so largely for what they consider to be symbolic, what I would call symbolic reasons. They are either religious and believe that the land belongs to the Jews, or they are defensive about Israel and believe that Israel simply has a right to that land, or that it's there or that it's part of Israel's security, or if the Israeli government says they need it, they need it. And those people, if they're ideologically driven, they're not as likely to get down into the details about what it actually means. Once you have an ideological position, you don't take it upon yourself to sort of, you don't feel like you need to learn all of the ins and outs and the details. And for those who are against it, they're already against it. So that means that they have at least know enough to have a strong position about why they don't support them. For those who don't know, I mean, the question is really how to take that as an opportunity to say, well, if they don't know, they're some sort of a blank slate. They've been told, they've probably been surrounded by, very intensive attitudes, intensive debates and opinions over the last 2.5 years. And we did have an interesting set of questions about who feels isolated within their Jewish communities over these issues. And we found that a higher percentage of people who lean to the progressive or left-wing side felt more isolated on these issues, which means they're probably a little less likely to ask questions openly and ask, questions about that reveal maybe that they don't know things. Like, people are afraid to ask questions oftentimes because they're just afraid to sound ignorant about things that everybody seems to have such a strong opinion about. And so I think there is an opportunity among those people who say they aren't sure because they just don't know. Really, it's a matter of lack of knowledge. And once they know more, then they're more likely to have an opinion. We also have an, indication that the people who are feeling isolated lean to the left. And I think that we shouldn't see that only as a matter of intimidation because of their views. We should see that as something that stops them from even asking basic questions and thereby getting the information they would need, which might be filtered through. I'm conflating a couple of things here, but it could be that people who lean to the progressive side, especially when it comes to Canadian life, right, don't know enough to form an opinion on this issue, but if they feel more open learning information, if they have, maybe if, your organizations are doing more outreach to people like that, they might have, feel more confident if they learn the issue more. And we might find that once they've learned the issue more, it could be that those people will be taking a more critical position as well, given that that's the direction of the majority of Canadian Jews already.
okay,
To be
thank
more
you.
critical on settlements, I mean, just in case that wasn't clear.
Okay, thank you. I do have another question for you. So thank you for that. And this one has to do with the support for Jewish advocacy, democracy, and peace groups. Heartening to see that there are so many. That's 64%, I think, were answered. This was an important thing to support. But yet there is another. The other interesting statistic there was that there are quite a large percentage who supported the idea of supporting Hasbara and the Israeli government. I think there wasn't such a big gap between support for the peace camp and support for Hasbara Israeli government. And I'm just wondering, what we can, why would that be? What can we infer from the data? What might we take out of it?
So I think that really goes into, in a way, what I said, the first kind of setup that I tried to give. Hasbara is something that I always feel like everybody knows it, but I think that it's something that, communities abroad, including Jewish communities, are still kind of learning about over in recent years, especially if they're not activists, right? And I think that for those, given that we saw that, 3/4 of Canadian Jews feel defensive about Israel in terms of this war, and feel that the war was justified, and basically think that Israel was justified with what it's doing. I think we have to understand that that translates into a sense of wanting to protect Israel in this context. And so I think that that's where you're seeing strong support for Hezbollah, because people feel like, well, if the war is justified, right? And I know this is, again, probably, a complicated thing to understand in a lot of ways, but I think the reality is that we saw the 76% think of it as either just war or hostage release or self-defense. If those people, vast majority of Canadian Jews, see that Israel's getting criticized and most of the criticism has to do with the war, then they're going to want to they're going to want to push back on that, right? So I think that this is very much focused on the here and now. At the same time, because we saw such a divergence of attitudes with relation to support for a two-state solution, support for or opposition to annexation settlements. That's why we see support for the peace camp, because ultimately that is also where the majority of Canadian Jews are going. I think, this is my interpretation. I'd have to, we'd have to do more qualitative research to prove it, but I do think that when people hear Hasbara these days, they're really thinking of defending Israel in the current debate, which was so heavily focused on the war. And that doesn't contradict the fact that the majority of Canadian Jews still support a two-state solution and think Israel would be better off if it reached a peace agreement or a final status accord with the Palestinians, something that is unfortunately, sort of remote from where the debate is in Israel these days. But to my mind, things that can look like a contradiction because we're used to putting them in ideological baskets actually aren't much of a contradiction if you see it the way the respondents of our survey probably saw it, which is Israel's a great country, Israel's a democracy, Israel has a right to exist, Israel was attacked and therefore should be defended in the public discourse. And Israel would be better off and would thrive if it reaches peace through a two-state solution, so we support the peace camp in Israel. Those don't
Amen.
actually contradict
Amen.
each other, I think, in the minds of many people.
Amen to the last part. That's certainly what we advocate. Anyway, thank you so much. That was very interesting.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gabriella. Okay, I'm going to ask the last question or two. Let's start with the first one, then if we don't get to the second one, because I also want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience as well. But I think let's go over to I think this is actually kind of related to what you were just talking to Gabriella about. Something that I wrote in our weekly email and that I wrote about on my Substack this past Shabbat was this data point specifically, which you've also talked about as well, in terms of like how Canadian Jews describe the war in Gaza and what we saw over the past just over 2 years. I will say that at our Haaretz conference in September, I referred to the war in Gaza as a war of annihilation. At JSpaceCanada, we've used terms like war crimes, ethnic cleansing, man-made famine. Ultimately, it probably doesn't really matter what we call it, but I think it does matter to us at JSpaceCanada that we acknowledge where we need to the brutality of the actions of the IDF in Gaza over the course of the war. Obviously, we also acknowledge the brutality of Hamas, not just on October 7th, but many years prior, and continuing now. But we do want to be able to name things as they are and recognize what is happening, so that to your point that you made to Gabriella, we want to see Israel be better and do better and acknowledge where things have gone wrong. So for us then as an organization, just like admitting right here, looking at these data points, that our positions are oftentimes far from the position of where the majority of our community finds itself. how do we use this data, or how do we use these answers to kind of build this discourse or build this dialogue that we really want to see around the actions that we've seen in Gaza over the past 2 years?
Well, this is a tough question because, especially like I said before, the situation has changed. There is something like a pause or an end. It's really not an end though. So I think, in a way, it's an easier position because you don't have to, get engaged in a battle over what to call the here and now in terms of the worst, terminology. That I mean, honestly, I think that in some ways the question about, what should everybody call it became a bit of a distraction from simply everybody, rallying to try to stop the war. And now that there is some sort of a transition, there's two ways you could look at it. One is, what is the importance of getting Canadian Jews or diaspora Jews to recognize how bad it was? Okay, and if you decide that that's important, then it really will be an uphill battle. I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it because I think there's value in taking a moral position, taking responsibility for this. And, I would say it really should open up a whole new era of soul searching about like, you know, Jews needing to realize that nobody is above, moral transgressions in this world. And we need to acknowledge that as human beings and as Jews, I think. But that's, me sort of superimposing this because I realize that it's going to be a very uphill battle. And it is a complex issue given, the absolute criminal brutality and, terrorist activity of Hamas, as you correctly point out on October 7th, but also well before that. So well, I don't want to get into all sorts of comparisons. It's a bit of a tangent, and every situation is a little bit different. But all to say that that is a valuable pursuit, and it will be a difficult pursuit. Beyond that, I think the question is, do you want to put your efforts into seeing what happens going forward? And honestly, I think that it'll be much easier for the majority of Canadian Jews to admit that Israel was in a very, bad situation, right? That it was both attacked and suffered, but also, caused a vast amount of damage, which is hugely damaging to Palestinian life, that is causing great trauma to the Israelis who did it and perpetrated it. We see the number of suicides going up and, terrible phenomena, consequences in Israeli society. It's weakened Israeli society in so many ways, politically, economically, socially, foreign relations, relations with the Jewish communities. These are things that nobody should want, to happen in the future. And I think that gives an opening to make a case that more Canadian Jews already believe in, which is let's not get there again. Let's not fall back into the complacency that the conflict can be managed, that, it's okay to just coast along because the maps are frozen. They are not frozen, right? The government's like, I think educating people about um, how Israel and the Palestinians got into the political predicament without, ever even suggesting that violence is justified. But the political predicament needs to be analyzed so that we can stop and say, wait, whatever we were doing before should change. And if you care about Israel, you need to learn what was really happening before, and it's not hidden. I mean, this is like one of my bigger themes is that by contrast to many of the other Israeli governments that kind of always um, obfuscated or didn't want to really, or like preferred policies of ambiguity and plausible deniability and never really made statements about what they were doing with relation to the Palestinians or with settlements or annexation. The current government has provided an easy opening since its establishment by declaring very openly in its coalition agreements that the aim is to have, Jewish sovereignty over all of the land, including Judea and Samaria. And so nobody should really claim, I mean, nobody should allow themselves to not know anymore. And I think that, one way to look at this is to say, okay, we can put aside the debates over what to name the horrors of what happened. We can all agree that it was horrible, whether you put the emphasis on whether it was horrible for Palestinians or horrible for Israel or both. But how do we identify accurately what was going on before then? Once we do that, we'll find that the majority of Canadian Jews were not for it, right? Because what was going on before then were settlement expansion, far-right extremism, terrorizing Palestinians through settler violence, and open declarations of annexation. And those things are happening now, actually in an accelerated fashion. Not only that, but we have a whole, segment of Israeli society that wants to build settlements in Gaza. And by the way, they're in power. Now, true, the Americans, for the meantime, are pressuring Israel to move on to some sort of transitional phase to something. But how to put this nicely, I wouldn't trust the Trump government. So I think it's, the responsibility of all Jewish communities who care about Israel, in general and in a democratic sense, to identify what was happening before, acknowledge that it's actually getting worse now, and realize that those were the pieces that led us to the most severe violence, in the history of Israeli society and this conflict.
Thank you very much for that. And I think that actually my second question, which we will have time to get to before we open up the Q&A, really does dovetail really nicely into that, because we're talking about, okay, where do we go from here, which is at JSpaceCanada and for our other partner organizations on this call, it is a two-state solution is what we're looking for. I sometimes feel like that's actually our biggest uphill battle, because something that the far right and far left have in common is the idea that the two-state solution is dead. On the right, it's like, it's dead, yay! And on the left, it's like, it's dead, move on, do something different, stop talking about this. And one of the data points that we asked in this survey, partly because we found it so interesting that we see something very similar in Israel, which is when we use terminology like two-state solution, we see a certain level of support. Now, with Canadian Jews, it's higher than I think in the Israeli population. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the case. So it's still a majority. It's still 52%. But then when we talk about regional normalization, a broader regional normalization with the Saudis, that includes the establishment of a Palestinian state. So we're still talking about a two-state solution, but we're not saying two-state solution. We're talking about it kind of in broader terms. We see support go up. And so I'm just kind of curious to know, I know this is kind of a hard question because it's very hypothetical, but what's your best guess or theory as to why we continuously see this to be the case? It's not going up by a couple percentage points. In Israel, it's going up by quite a bit. Even here, we see it's a difference of 10 percentage points. And also how can we capitalize on it to not be in this kind of position where we're continuously being squeezed out of, no longer having support for a two-state solution, or being able to push that as a solution?
Yeah, okay. So first of all, just to confirm what you already mentioned about Israeli society, I mean, support for the two-state solution in a general sense in the tracking question that we've been asking for years is much lower than 52%. It's by the most recent survey research, it's somewhere around between 30 and 34% of Israeli society, and significantly lower among the Jewish population in Israel. Okay, now the reason why there's both lower support among Canadian Jews than there is for the regional context that includes a Palestinian state, is the same reason, I think, why the Israeli Jewish community also shows much higher support for the regional approach that includes a Palestinian state next to Israel, rather than the old terminology of the two-state solution. And to some extent, it's a matter of terminology, but I think that when we say it's a matter of terminology, that distracts us on some level from the fact that it's a matter of reality. Okay, so when you say two-state solution, for one thing, it is an idea that's been around, for about 25 years now, right? It really became a paradigmatic approach for resolving the conflict after, or during and after, the Camp David negotiations of the year 2000. Okay, I'm emphasizing that because we often misremember that it was a paradigmatic, everybody knows kind of solution before that, and it was not. It wasn't even for the Palestinians well before that. The Palestinians first embraced the idea of a state next to Israel only in 1988. Okay, and so at least they were kind of going in that direction for longer. But from the Israeli perspective, certainly from the Israeli leadership, which by definition is the Israeli Jewish perspective, the Oslo process never talked about a state for the Palestinians. The term two-state solution was only used by radical lefties, if at all. We used to say, and I was one of them back in the early 90s, and we said things like two states for two peoples. We didn't say two-state solution. But having put that aside, 25 years is a long time still, right? So if we're looking at the early 2000s, when the two-state solution became paradigmatic, it was tried and failed so many times, at least in terms of trying to get there, right? The Camp David negotiations, the civil society initiative, the Taba talks after that in 2001, civil society initiatives, 2008, 8 under Olmert, 2013, 14 under Netanyahu and the Obama administration, it all failed. And so I think year after year after year, people started to not only not believe that it was possible, which is a major driver of rising opposition when people don't think it's feasible. But also, increasingly, I don't think people know what we mean anymore. I mean, anybody who knows the situation on the ground knows that, settlements have sprawled so far out into and across the West Bank that it's not really clear what a Palestinian state actually means. And so, and what does it mean in terms of Jerusalem? Like people don't really know. And then when we tell them the actual line items, because in my deeper survey research in Israel, we actually go through every single item of a two-state solution, then support is usually lower once people do know what it means. So that's one thing. The paradigm seems either impossible to implement or not even clear what it refers to anymore. And I think that that's probably, a similar explanation for Canadian Jewish population. Although I think the Canadian Jews, the difference is that the Canadian Jewish respondents in our survey still view it as a kind of symbolic, symbol of peace. So they still see it as sort of synonymous, just another way of saying a peace agreement, even if they don't totally know where it stands. Now, by contrast, when you talk about a regional dimension, you say Israel will normalize with Arab countries, and as part of that, they will guarantee security together with the US, and then there'll be a Palestinian state within that. First of all, it's a very logical understanding of how to diversify danger, right? Diversifying risk is something we all know about in finance. And when Israelis are being asked to take the risk, it seems a lot easier when they have other backers. And I think that, the Canadian Jewish population, again, is influenced by dynamics in the region and know that, the Palestinian leadership is very hard to trust if it even exists. And yet there can be other guarantor powers and other actors involved. The bilateral track looks dead to most people. And in fact, it basically is dead. So I think that people are seeing that reality. And so, the other amazing thing that happens is that public opinion changes not only due to, the right survey research or the right terminology changes, but when reality changes. And the fact is that Israel has opened diplomatic relations with Arab countries in ways that it hadn't done before, although partially. So, people tend to forget that Israel has two very long-standing peace agreements with Arab countries in the region, Egypt and Jordan, for decades. But the reality is that they weren't really seen as such prominent breakthroughs. And then the Abraham Accords under the first Trump administration led to a kind of, really, it was only, it's only two robust agreements, right? The agreement with Morocco is sort of, it's a little bit under the radar. And Sudan, of course, there's a horrible civil war going on there. It's not an agreement that was ever actually realized. But the relationship with the Gulf has changed people's mentality over what the Middle East can be. It can be a place of, different countries that are distinguished. They're not all just hostile Muslim or Arab countries. They have their own interests, and some of those interests are overlapping with Israel. And they have proven that they're willing to actually take that extra leap of normalizing with Israel. And so that when that becomes a reality, suddenly people are able to see that there's something material the survey isn't just saying it, it relates to what people actually know. There are potential allies in the region who are willing to openly declare their relationships with Israel and are invested in trying to help guarantee something like a two-state solution, or the establishment of a Palestinian state next to Israel. And so that it explains very much why people can grasp what it would look like, which they really can't do when they're trying to envision just a bilateral process, because they can't understand who the Palestinian leadership is. Frankly, neither can I. Most Palestinians don't know either. And those two sides don't trust each other, and everybody abroad who cares and knows the issue and following it closely doesn't trust the other side either.
Right.
When it's just the bilateral track is what I mean.
Right. Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, it's interesting too. I love what you said, and I totally agree with that as well, that like opinions change when reality changes. And I would have loved to have asked the question before the ceasefire, because we saw broad support for the ceasefire. 66%, I think, supported the ceasefire as opposed to staying in a state of war. Would have been interesting to see if we had gotten to ask that question before there was a ceasefire agreement, if that would have changed at all, because exactly to your point, when reality changed, we saw a lot of support for that reality, but we will not know that. So, but
remember that can go both ways too. I mean, just as a complete aside, the vast majority of Israelis supported a ceasefire agreement throughout this time, and then especially when it was presented, very incredibly high level supported. Now, satisfaction with how it's being implemented in Israel has gone down. It's still a majority, but it's gone down. And, that's because reality is not always so great.
Right. Yeah. Good point. Good point. I'm ever the optimist. Okay, so there's a lot of really great questions in the Q&A. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to try to clump some of them together to allow us to get through. And I noticed right off the bat that there were a few questions that were strictly methodology. So I'm going to ask you a few of those questions kind of all combined because I think they might be some easier answers. So I had someone asking about both the proportion of Francophone Jews, which in our survey is low, it's at 2%, whereas the Francophone Jews actually represent more than 6% of the Canadian Jewish population. And that's the same for the young Jewish population. It was 3% in our sample, but more than 13% according to a survey that this person's referencing from 2014. So that's just keep that in your pocket. I also wanted to ask about, someone had asked about the sample size. So at certain points, our sample size is 502, and sometimes we note it as lower. So just a question as to why that is. And then just one more. Someone was asking, this is actually a pretty simple one, I think, like how we found our sample. So who is this poll drawn from? And what sense do you make of Jews who identify themselves as other versus those who identify as just Jewish? Survey numbers, sample sizes, and the demographic data.
So one thing I have to defer a little bit to our data collection agency because they're the ones who have built the sample. Although what we did was we looked very carefully at all known statistics that we know about the Canadian Jewish community, and where there was a major gap that we think, certainly ones that we know affected opinions, then we weighted the data to make sure that we had relatively commensurate reflections of the Canadian Jewish population. And so where there are very minor differences and we only have very small numbers to go on, you can't do aggressive weighting because then you're basically trying to expand the weight or the value of certain respondents in the survey based only on very small proportions. So we have to be careful with that kind of thing. And even when you look at the survey breakdowns, if the audience is going through the survey, you'll see that certain populations, if we do a kind of cross tabulation or breakdown and the sample size for that particular segment is small, we will note that because you can't really generalize if any given sample is below 30 people, for example. So when we had numbers that were too small, you can't weight them too far up because then you're just taking a couple of random people and saying you're worth a lot more than you are. But we did try to do it for the communities that we know are key to explaining people's opinions. So for example, we looked very carefully at things like religious affiliation to the extent possible and trying to make sure they were commensurate, including, by the way, between the two split samples so that we wouldn't skew the responses to our split populations when we did those exercises because they happened to be different demographically. We made sure they were pretty similar demographically on those issues, particularly things like religious affiliation, political breakdown, and individual and self-identified ideology to make sure they weren't vastly different so that wouldn't be the explanation for their different responses. So we did what we could. No sample is ever going to be perfect on very, very small subsamples. That's the nature of polling. But Leger, the company that we've worked with, is a company that we've worked with in the past. They specialize in developing samples of subpopulations in Canada, and we drew the sample based on the known demographic qualities of the Canadian Jewish community, which was actually originally based on the prior research with the help of Professor Brim, right? Who really, that's his field. He studies the demographics of Canadian Jewish society. In terms of, I'm trying to remember the second, the numbers. Yeah. So the differences between, okay, so on the numbers, the total sample size is 502. But in some of the breakdowns, the question about how people identified as Jewish was asked in a number of different ways to make sure that we were capturing everybody who would be considered part of the Jewish population. So we had one question that asked, the whole range of different ethnic backgrounds in Canada, and people who said Jewish were included. Then within those, we had another question about how they self-identified. And so, we had different ways of testing this, and we looked at some of the crosstabs you're seeing are within the subsample of those who answered the second kind of question about Jewish identity. And so it's a smaller sample than the full 502. But in terms of difference between other and just Jewish, I think that I don't really have an explanation for why people would answer other rather than just Jewish. I mean, it's hard. I don't know. I'm not familiar with those definitions, but I can tell you that there were consistent differences in terms of how they answered the questions. So the people who fell into the other category, who within the question of Jewish affiliation didn't categorize themselves as, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, other, they categorized themselves, or just Jewish, but fell into the other category. They were consistently among the more liberal or progressive parts of the sample. And so they definitely had a distinct political identity, where just Jewish seems to have fallen somewhere more like the Reform slack between the Reform and conservative. So they are, I think the major difference I would say is that just Jewish people are identifying themselves as Jewish more significantly, even if they, maybe don't belong to a synagogue and therefore haven't had to define themselves by an affiliation. Whereas the others, seem to be identifying as Jewish, but really not thinking of themselves, maybe not even thinking of themselves Jewish in a day-to-day sense, other than when they're asked, what is your background? And so that'd be my guess. But the fact is that you can see very consistently where they diverge in the survey. They're not fundamentally different, but by degrees, the other category tends to be on the much more progressive side of our survey
Right.
responses to the questions about Israel.
Also it's a smaller, I think, sample
Yes,
size of folks who are
yes,
identifying as
that's
other
true.
versus just Jewish. Yeah. Okay, great. Great for the methodology. I think those are all the methodology questions, but if I find another one, I'll let you know. The next question, someone asked, and this I think is kind of an intersection of all the work that you do, what strategies have been shown to successfully change public opinion?
Well, that's a good question because there's different, the question about whether you change public opinion and it matters which direction you're trying to change it. I mean, I don't think there's any one strategy. I've been working on campaigns for, 27 years now, and, it can be rather specific to any given campaign. But this is going to sound like a cop out, but it's really not. The changes in reality are the best way of changing minds, right? All the messages, all the strategies that we can come up with. I've never seen anything change minds as well as actual developments on the ground. Um, and the other thing that changes minds is when you have the biggest possible amplifier. So, what I've seen is that there have been very significant changes in attitudes in Israeli society over issues that really took on a different role in Israel, like the judiciary. That was really, we did not see such a major political breakdown 20 years ago, but has become extremely politicized over the years. And the reason why we have that is because the government has been in power for so long that it has, an enormous amplification factor because it's the government, so that everything they do is covered heavily in the media. They have enormous mouthpieces and audiences. That creates a kind of, spiraling sense that everywhere you turn, you're seeing the critique of the judiciary, especially if you're a supporter of this government. And I don't just mean this government. I mean all of Netanyahu's governments from 2008, 9, well, 2009 onward. And so it's been, at this point, 17 years, but even up until 2023, we were talking about 14 years of, having major media amplifiers affiliated with the government, associated with the government, whatever you want to call it, but repeating those lines. If you're a minister, if you're a prime minister, every single word you do is going to get, a huge amount of attention. And so that's another way of changing minds. And all of those two things are before I even talk about political campaigns. And so the next thing I would say for political campaigns is that it's very hard to change minds on anything 3 months before an election. Okay. These have to be seen in the long game. You've got to look at things long term. And within that, the basic campaign strategies generally are pretty effective. Repetition of the message is number one. The number one. I mean, none of this is rocket science, right? You say something over and over and over again. I mean, I don't believe lies become truth, but well, not everything, many perspectives we're trying to get across are absolutely true. They're not lies, but repeating them really helps. The other major thing we know from political campaigns is that, like I said, you can't really change minds. What you can do sometimes is bring out latent attitudes or educate the public on things they don't know. And so I wouldn't say there's a strategy necessarily for flipping people's perspectives, but for giving them information they didn't have. That is very effective. And especially when it's an issue that's a bit of an unknown, where you have a high don't know rate or a tabula rasa, the first thing people hear, the first major, factoid or perspective or narrative on something is very often the impression they stay with, that stays over time, first impression. And so getting that message across, getting onto a topic that's not well understood can be very effective. And I would say in some ways, that was the success of those who were opposed to the judicial overhaul in Israel in communicating it abroad, because the first time that many, Western audiences heard about it, it was pretty much from those who were up in arms against it, against the judicial overhaul, who were making their case in a way before the government had a chance to defend what it was doing, which is why so much of the Western audiences really thought it was terrible, including some of the more conservative and pro-Israel communities were very, basically opposed to the judicial overhaul. So that's a good example of where people didn't have strongly fixed opinions on the issue because they simply didn't know a lot about it. Getting the information to them as soon as possible with the perspective you want is a very good way of, making sure that message gets across. And in terms of, if the question was really, how do you completely change people's minds? How do you take somebody who supports settlements and annexation and turn them into somebody who supports equality for self-determination for Jews and Palestinians? I've been fascinated by that question for many years. I listen to people's stories when they've been through something like that, and it's very rarely because of a political campaign. What I've managed to gather over years of having these kinds of conversations is that people somehow were exposed to the other side, usually not through a dialogue program, usually through a friend or in their army service or an activity of some sort, and having arguments and conversations in spontaneous ways, or occasionally like taking a class and reading about stuff. But it's rare, it's rare in general for people to make that 180 shift. But when it happens, it tends to be a progression. I have not generally heard people tell me that overnight they suddenly had this awakening. It's usually like a process that eventually feels complete, but can take years.
Really fascinating answers. Thank you to who asked that question, because I loved both of those answers. That was very interesting. And our next question actually kind of, I think, relates to that a little bit, which is someone asking, and we touched on this a bit, but how do you make sense of these findings about how the current Israeli government messaging about the war has informed majority opinions of the war, but less on those broader policies? So we talked about like there is less the messaging around like settlement expansion or annexation does not have that same level of support. So is it a fog of war and emotional story, or is it media sources, politicization and messaging from kind of establishment Jewish organizations? What is the reason that we see so much defensiveness around the war, but a lot less around and a lot more opposition towards some of those broader government policies?
Again, I mean, the broader government policies have been in place for a long time, and the Canadian Jewish community, as we found out, is paying very close attention to Israel since the war. But I don't think you get to over 80% from nothing. They were obviously paying pretty close attention before that as well. And so I think people had opinions about settlements, annexation, two-state solution, before the war. In terms of why people feel defensive about the war, well, I mean, Hamas had a lot to do with it. October 7th is really, a standout kind of historical event. It's along the lines of September 11th, not just because of the number of people killed, although really it's staggering to think that in a country as small as Israel, you had basically a third of the people who were killed in the U.S. On September 11th. I mean, the U.S. is way more than 3 times bigger than Israel. So it is a staggering number of people, but more than that, let me just say something about terrorism. One of the classic understandings of terrorism is that it is designed to terrorize psychologically and performatively. A lot of times terrorism kills far fewer actual people than other kinds of wars, right? But and October 7th being somewhat of an exception because it was such a deadly day altogether. But in general, think about ISIS. They killed like very few Westerners were actually killed, but they were done in a performative way. Very gruesome beheadings. We all remember that. is anybody paying attention now to, the Kurds in Syria who are being attacked by al-Jilani's forces? Not so much, even though gruesome things are happening there too. But terrorism, by definition, has a performative and symbolic aspect to it. And the way October 7th happened was so extreme. It involves such, barbaric activities that is hard for many people to even see beyond. And I think that for the Canadian Jewish Society, who's deeply invested in Israel, that will loom very, very large. Again, I don't think this is like such a sophisticated answer, because the reality is that if that's the only thing people see, they're going to have a hard time acknowledging that Israel is, also doing, or was and is doing terrible things to Palestinians who don't deserve it, right? The innocents, the civilians, collective punishment, siege, starvation, all of those things, and indiscriminate, not to mention indiscriminate destruction. I think that, when people are consumed by their, by being victims, it crowds out everything else. It's not just like, can't you hold two thoughts at once, which is a nice thing to say, and is certainly something I hold people responsible for on easier positions. But when it comes to people feeling themselves to be the victims, and I think there is a vicarious sense from diaspora Jews about feeling like Israelis on October 7th, it simply muscles out the ability to see that you are simultaneously perpetrating crimes against other people. And so I don't think it's, government messaging being so effective in a campaign sense. I think that's, again, reality setting the terms, that makes it very hard for people to see. What I do think has been effective, though, is constant denialism. And I got to say that we have, really unacceptable and maybe a somewhat, maybe not, no, I shouldn't say unprecedented, but certainly unacceptable levels of denialism coming from both the defensive side of Israel and the pro-Palestinian defensive illiberal camp. And that denialism, I think, has no place in any society with integrity. So, but I do think it's effective. So there have been so many people who rallied to, pick apart any suggestion that Israel might have been doing something wrong and, dismantle or try to dismantle, usually with pretty pathetic results, but try to dismantle evidence. I mean, overwhelming evidence, of indiscriminate attacks on civilians and on, refugee camps in Gaza, and I mean, declared policies of collective punishment. And nevertheless, there are people who self-recruited, who volunteered basically to try to pick these apart and question every number and question everything. And I think that is very effective at changing minds in a negative way. And similarly, we have, again, people in what I call the illiberal left. I don't even like to call them left because I think it doesn't square with what I think of as left. But, who deny, for example, what Hamas did, right? Oh, the people mostly died because of Israeli fire, or sexual assault didn't happen. Well, if you're spending your time doing that, you're raising questions, you're sowing doubt, you're picking apart tiny little details to try to, delegitimize the entire big picture. And so that's effective in that camp too. And I think both sides really need to be wary of that. If you're approaching this issue with good faith and integrity, just everybody needs to be wary of denialism. And I do think denialism has been effective for those who had a hard time seeing what our side, whatever side you're on, was doing wrong to begin with. Denialism is very convenient.
So there's actually a question, I think that segues really nicely into that, because I think another piece of the denialism, like, a lot of what's been happening with settler violence, it's becoming harder and harder to deny that because we see it all the time. Everyone has cameras, and the more that we see, diaspora activists or Israeli activists, people that we hold in high regard. We have Rabbi MK Gilad Kariv very often in the West Bank, showing videos, becomes harder and harder to deny it. And so there's a really interesting question around that of like, and again, this is all conjecture and hypothetical, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Do you think it will be harder to do that denialism, and will things change once and if foreign journalists are allowed into Gaza?
I think foreign journalists being let into Gaza is critical. So let me just say I went to the Supreme Court this week to listen to the hearing over this issue. And it was, honestly, I think the state's argument has really, fallen apart basically with the so-called ceasefire. Either there's a ceasefire or there's not. And yet the state is still claiming there's a security problem with them going in, even though humanitarian workers go in all the time. So I think that, the coverage is desperately needed. Having said that, it's a strange question because I mean it's a legitimate question, but I mean we know what's happening in Gaza. There has been so much, again, overwhelming documentation, and the documentation flew out faster than any delegitimizers or denialists could possibly pick it apart. And so we really do know the big picture. We will have more nuanced views. We will have views filtered through sources that some Westerners will find more credible than Palestinian sources, but ultimately, I think that you'd have to be a denialist to not know the scale of destruction at this point. In terms of settler violence, you know, I don't see how you can deny it even today. Again, like I'm not sure if people are denying it today, it's because they really don't want to see it or because they're finding excuses for it. I mean, the Israeli government runs around saying, well, this is just, a small group of troubled youth. And yet when there's no arrests, then it's a dead giveaway that they don't want to stop it, right? Um, there is an ongoing case in Israel. I mean, this is a little bit of a tangent, but you just need to pay attention and put these dots together because there's an ongoing case right now about an unsolved murder from the 1990s, which is under a gag order, but there have been some breakthroughs in the case recently. And, a whole battalion of police special forces descended on an Arab town to try to sweep up like 5 people wanted for questioning. And then it turned out that the information was completely wrong. It didn't actually amount to anything and they were let go. So the Arab community here is like, why don't they do that when it comes to fighting crime, which is taking an unprecedented amount of lives, at a pace, at a rate that is unprecedented in Israel? And when you have that kind of possible aggressive action, why aren't they doing that against settlers who are committing attacks in the West Bank? Because they don't want to. And I think that's increasingly hard to get around. I don't see how anybody can get around it, honestly. So if you're denying that kind of thing, or you're justifying it, or you're making excuses for it, then you're probably really the most ideologically committed. You have to do like mental gymnastics at this point not to admit that that's what's going on and that the government is tolerating and enabling it and often actually, kind of empowering security forces, many times to accompany them or even participate because many of the people who are serving in IDF uniforms in those areas come from those same settlements.
Right. And so, kind of related to that in terms of what people support and why. Someone asked, going back to slide 43, support for Hezbollah and the Israeli government rises as we move to the right politically, and support for the Israeli peace, anti-occupation, and human rights camps falls, but support for simply the peace camp. So we asked those as 2 different questions, the Israeli peace camp and then the Israeli peace, anti-occupation, human rights camp. When we say just the peace camp, it stays fairly consistent across the political spectrum. Can you explain why that might be and what we should infer from the data?
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of thing that to be really credible, we'd have to do, interviews and qualitative research. But I think that the basic answer that I can gather from my many years of polling is that people love to be identified with peace. Everybody thinks they like peace. And so, when you ask it in the most general way, you're likely to have across the board support. Israelis think so too. It's just a matter of, well, what do you actually mean by peace? The right wing here will say it supports peace as well. What they mean by peace is Israel controls everything and Palestinians can't threaten anybody. That's how the far right would, or not even the far right, that's how the right wing would say it. So I think that's, the easiest explanation, not having actually probed this by asking people themselves, what did you mean when you said that?
Yeah, I would tend to agree. Okay, so speaking about, let's stay on the Canadian Jewish community for a second. And being someone who has polled various different communities and has lived in various different communities, your personal opinion here, do you think, based on the results, the Canadian Jewish community is among the most conservative in the diaspora?
I mean, I shouldn't overstate the case. I have polled in many different societies, including places like Serbia, and Greece and the UK, and the general population in those places, and Ukraine. I mean, I should not, pretend that I'm an expert in diaspora Jewish communities all around the world. I follow American Jewish opinion quite closely. I have spent time, in other Jewish communities, but I can't say I know them as systematically. I don't know survey research on French Jewish communities, for example. So I can't say. I mean, I think that there are numerous Jewish communities I've encountered who seem to compete for that title. I think the Australian Jewish community people have
Yes.
told me this is the most conservative Jewish community. I mean, the Australian Jews tell me that. So, I mean, it would, we'd have to repeat this exact same survey in one of those places and try to figure that out. No, I don't think so. In fact, I think that in our survey, we found, numerous progressive attitudes somewhere along a progressive spectrum. And so, yes, there was high defensiveness about the war, but that's not really surprising to me. The war is the most sensitive, life or death, immediate, visceral part of what's going on right now. And yet we found majorities who were able to separate their defensiveness about Israel during the war and oppose settlements and support, two states and support a peace camp. I mean, those are progressive positions. So I think the Canadian Jewish community, how shall I say this, without sounding like I'm trying to be cute? I'm not trying to be cute. I think it's subtle, nuanced, complex, and reflects very much what I think of as Canadian characteristics. And I say that as a proud Canadian.
Yay.
Does everybody know that I have Canadian citizenship?
Very, very important to know. I should have noted that at the beginning, actually, because that is one of the things we like about you the most, Dahlia. Yeah, and
And
I
not
think,
only that, but I wrote a very laudatory column about Mark Carney last week.
oh,
So that's
great.
also
And
self-promotion for my Haaretz column.
it was in your Haaretz column? Okay, I was on vacation, so I didn't read it, but I will include it in the email that we send out about this. And I just want to add to what you were saying too. I think as kind of a progressive leader in the Jewish community, and I see this in other communities, oftentimes, yeah, we're not that different. Oftentimes, what's lacking is more so a kind of more progressive or alternative infrastructure that people can self-identify with, and that makes them kind of appear stronger. In the U.S., where there's also a higher Jewish population, and there's higher, people can identify with if not now, or Jewish Voices for Peace, or J Street, or whoever. There's a massive, massive kind of left-leaning infrastructure, so you hear the voice more because there's more resources to put behind it. There's more kind of pushback on maybe the mainstream narrative. That's what's, to me, so interesting about these surveys, is that we see how people are really feeling as opposed to anecdotally what we may hear or not hear in our communities. And so I just want to ask, okay, so two more questions that I think hopefully can be answered really quickly, and then that'll bring us to time. And I think that both these questions probably, we might both have answers for these. The first is, did those who conducted the survey keep a record of those who refused participation, and might refusing indicate anything about underlying thinking or opinions? I think that people self-selected in. I don't know if we have any data of people if people refused, but I'll let you answer as well. So pin in that for 1 second. And then, why didn't you guys ask if respondents thought war crimes had been committed? I'm curious how many of the respondents who said the war was justified think that any war crimes have been committed. I feel like it was just one of the words that we overlooked and we should have used, but on either of those
We
two.
didn't overlook it. We didn't
Did we
overlook
ask
it. We
about
had
war
it.
crimes?
Yeah, we had it in the question of what do you think best describes this war? We had war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and genocide.
Yes, correct. We did. Thank you. But we didn't. It's true that we didn't ask if people thought
We didn't
any
ask it
war
separately.
crimes had been committed,
Right.
but that would have been an interesting question. Maybe the next
Yeah.
time. And then, am I right about the people whether or not people could refuse the survey? Do you have any insight into that?
We'd have to ask Leger about that because they have their methodology in that. But I can tell you that usually, I mean, I really shouldn't guess, but I can tell you that from general surveys that are drawn from internet panels, and I'm not sure if people know what that means, but surveys that are conducted by internet, what happens is, the companies who develop these surveys will develop a whole panel of like 100,000 people, or 70 to 150,000 people, hopefully representing a lot of society, and then they'll send a link out and try to get the people who represent the quotas of reflecting that population. Now, usually when it's a general population, more people want to do the survey than needed, because the quotas have to get the right amount of men and women and regional distribution, et cetera. So usually there's like 3,000 people who want to do a survey, who try to opt in for a survey of like 500. That would be for a general population study. And so in this case, it would be a little different because we were looking specifically for a subpopulation. But we may have had refusals. We may have also had people who wanted to, but we couldn't use their participation because they, were, too many people responding from Ontario or something like that. So you'd have to look at both of those in order to try to see how they might have affected attitudes. But of course, naturally, it's very hard to know what people's attitudes might be if they don't participate in the survey. What I can also say is that back in the days of telephone surveys, we had a very high refusal rate there too. And so refusal is always a problem. It got worse over time with telephones in all countries I worked in because telephone became a place where people only called really if there was like marketing and stuff, and everybody moved to cell phones, and either you called people's cell phones or you couldn't reach them by landlines. On cell phones, people had caller ID, so it became harder and harder to do that. We had huge non-response rates from phone as well. So I would say it's always an issue, but it's balanced out by those who want to and can't be used. And it's also not that different from the kinds of refusal problems we have with other methodologies. In terms of war crimes, yeah, it would have been interesting to ask it as a separate question and say, even if you support the war, do you think any war crimes were committed by Israel? Frankly, we just didn't have room, and we had, you have limited space in a survey, and we had lots of topics we wanted to ask. We stuck in extra questions by splitting the sample, which is a little trick for asking a few more questions than you have room for, but couldn't get to everything. Nevertheless, these are all always good suggestions to keep track of because, it would be worth asking in the future. And the reason I say that is because A, you may do surveys in the future. And B, it could be that with distance, with time, the emotional defensiveness might go down and the information level might go, especially when foreign journalists are allowed in. Although I think a lot of that information is really already known, but still, that those two factors might lead people to acknowledge that kind of thing over time, even though we may not have a measure over time. Although, if you ask the same question we asked, where it was one of 6 ways of describing the war, it would be interesting to see how that changes over time.
Yeah, yeah. Good to keep in our back pocket. We're going to keep doing this, so we can definitely get to those questions in future surveys. So we're right at the end of our time. This is a wonderful webinar. I learned so much, and we've been working on this for months, and I still had a lot to learn. So thank you so much, Dahlia, first and foremost,
My
for
pleasure.
being so
Thank
generous
you
with
for
your
bringing me
time
in.
and your knowledge.
It's a privilege to do the project.
Thank you, thank you. And just really quickly, thank you also to all of you who joined us today. This work really could not happen without your engagement and more than anything else, without your donations. They really allow us to continue to do this work. A reminder that today we had 3 great progressive Canadian Jewish Zionist organizations working on this, and really a donation to 1, 2, or all 3 of us is what allows us to continue this work. We will send out a recording, and I think our partners will as well. We will send out a recording in the coming days. In it, we will also include the article that Dahlia mentioned from her column, and her column is fantastic in Haaretz all the time. So subscribe there and read that if you are not. And we also did another webinar with Dahlia and with John Allen, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, a year and a bit ago about recognition of Palestinian statehood, which is something we also continuously ask about. So I'm going to link to that as well in our email if folks want to kind of refresh their memory or hear more from Dahlia now that we've had this experience of working with you a little bit more closely. Thank you so much again, everybody. Recording coming out soon, and a donation to any of our organizations is much appreciated. Dahlia, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who joined us today.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.